was often rumoured that Assassin's Creed would head east into the land of the rising sun, but the rumours came true this year with Assassin's Creed Shadows, coming out on the back of similar titles that have taken much from the long-running series themselves, such as Rise of the Ronin, and of course Sucker Punch's 2020 magnum opus, Ghost of Tsushima, an obvious inspiration for this current Ubisoft team as much as Assassin's Creed did for Sucker Punch themselves. Packed with upgrades to the Anvil engine, dual protagonist to journey through the game, and a swathe of new features, including the return of base camp building, is this a new leap forward for the series, or just more of the same? Let's dive in. Now, Ubisoft have a long and arduous history, right back before the 16-bit days of the Atari ST and Amiga. Ubiquitous by name and by nature, the family-run company grew a mail-order company into a worldwide software giant. But within their DNA has always been a desire, passion and skill to push forward, stand out and innovate, be it in gameplay, interaction, graphics and technology. From Defender of the Crown, Unreal, no, not that one, Rayman, Splinter Cell, and of course the Assassin's Creed series, created by Patrice Décelle and Jade Redmond back in 2007 during the PS360 era. Since then, the series has straddled the line of historical fan fiction and enjoyable open-ended stealth gameplay with varying levels of success. But from a technical standpoint, it started life as a leader and has often pushed the medium forward with rendering, AI, choice, and believable worlds. From the first, the third, Black Flag Seafaring, and certainly 2014's Unity, which still stands proud within the franchise on a graphical perspective, with much of the modern games, including Shadows, relying heavily on the work and updates to that same Anvil engine that has powered every entry since inception. Shadows is the first exclusive to current-gen consoles and modern PC GPUs, offering the biggest technical tick box in ray tracing, RTGI in fact, that complements or replaces the image-based lighting from the prior games, along with ray trace reflections, strand-based hair, Ubisoft's own version of nanite in Micropolygonns, and a greatly enhanced procedural destruction system to enhance the sword-wielding combat within. Now on this front, the visual quality and art is balanced well, with the clear muses of wind, foliage movement and interaction being taken from the core focus of Tsushima Isle. But with a split protagonist means you have two distinct ways to play that reward their unique strengths and punish you for their weaknesses. Starting with the lighting and how the game scales using the PC version, we have a polished, clean and detailed front-end menu. No intrusive shader compilation is visible, likely an async process at the start, and no performance stutters were noted during hours of play across multiple machines. The menu is standard high-quality Ubisoft level, offering intricate tweaking with a visual representation of what each setting does. Ray tracing can be set to hideout only, world GI, or GI and specular, which is reflections. Then beyond this, many settings offer low, medium, high, very high, and ultra high. These broad levels of scaling help the game run across a breadth of machines, from my entry-level 6GB RTX4050 laptop right up to the top-end 32GB RTX5090. In between, we get AMD's RX6800 and of course the PS5, the PS5 Pro, but rest assured that you can tweak the game well to balance quality and performance, helped by a full suite of upscalers and frame generation that can be mixed and matched with Anvil's own TA8, DLSS3, FSR3, XESS, which offers a good trade-off between image quality, but none achieve the perfect level, and that includes the use of frame generation. Let's break down the visual features then, and starting with the global illumination, the biggest single increase. Now, the image-based lighting that it had before is a good solution, present in prior games, and relies on runtime dynamic cube maps taken from fixed points of day. These sample points are like cube maps, and scattered across the world they deliver a convincing level of sun and moonlight bounce, with interiors and exteriors affected. The ray trace boost really offers two key benefits. This global illumination is now far more accurate, with multiple bounces factored in, allowing more concave areas to receive more or some light, along with it dynamically shifting based on occluders within the world, such as screen doors. This brings more light and shadow, along with shifts of light as objects move, and it brings colour of that light radiosity bounce. More impactful outdoors though is the RTAO element, or ray traced ambient occlusion, which adds far better and stronger self-occlusion and depth to static and dynamic objects. Both indoor and outdoor are enhanced by this feature, and it can greatly improve the game's visual impact, specifically on interiors with light coming in from outside. It significantly increases material reactions from both diffuse and specular, when it's chosen in the menu at least, although this is not for free and the increase is not always so drastic, going from off to ultra ray tracing with reflections included, improving water bodies, highly specular surfaces such as metal, water, wet stone and wood, and others. The game is far more physically accurate and pleasing on the eye. And it costs around 33% at its highest level of performance on my RTX 4050, and again on other GPUs it's a similar level of impact. Reflections themselves are always better than the long-standing SSR or screen space reflection issues, but the increase is not as large as other games, and it really helps to reduce the disocclusion, frustum and flickering artifacts SSR can bring, rather than the same visual punch the GI and AO offer from the ray trace solution. It is welcome nonetheless, and it certainly improves certain specific areas of the game where there's wet wood or wet areas for specular reflection both indoors and out, and it offers a balance of making that choice between a circa 15% extra cost with this enabled in performance or turning it off, which aligns closely to what it runs on many PC rigs I've tested here and on consoles. The other big update is Micropolygonns, and much like Nanite from Unreal Engine 5 and mesh shaders, which were pushed out in DirectX 12 and pushed heavily by Nvidia many years ago, Anvil now supports their own solution, Micropolygonns. Now these do the same thing, effectively clustering objects into batches that are constantly shifting to balance load with quality and minimize the amount of cost per triangle. This means static meshes such as rocks, houses, all seamlessly scale up as you move through the world. Grass, foliage and other animated or skinned meshes still use standard LODs, so these can shift and pop still as before. But so long as the level is around high, the world suffers far less from popping, imposter billboard swaps and jarring shifts of objects. Like the ray tracing features added, the procedural destruction system does seem to share elements from the Snowdrop engine from Massive. Used from The Division, Avatar and Star Wars last year, here though the solution covers katana slices, bamboo cuts and even beheading, although here they're mostly canned animation sets. You can break down many objects in the world now, including trees, shrubs, barrels, screen doors and more. Although not exhaustive, it adds far more physics interaction in the world and can improve combat, even if the persistence of these objects can be short once destroyed. Along with the tessellated water, the wave and collision system, it does offer a good degree of physical properties in combat, traversal, lighting and material reactions. And finally, in the big ticket visual updates, hair splines or strands is the last big boost. Neho gets the full L'Oreal treatment with dense geometric hair polygons that collide, sway, reflect light and even cast shadows. Other NPCs can also use the system with equally pleasing effect. On consoles, this is always enabled in the real-time cutscenes, which are capped to 30 or 31 in all modes, even on PC without a mod. But on PC, you can turn this off fully. With these disabled in gameplay in the performance mode on consoles, even on the PS5 Pro, but balanced and quality mode run these during gameplay on either your own character and some select short-range NPCs. With the quality being set at the highest level, this can improve some of the areas, but it's most impactful during those real-time cinematics. But they are still capped at 30 FPS on every piece of hardware. One other area I want to mention is the fact that the hair gets wet during rain and looks significantly different and more accurate as it clumps together into tighter bands. A nice touch and something you notice during gameplay as well as cinematics. Now the engine scales well, but some options cost more than others, aside textures and resolution. As noted, ray tracing costs approximately 33% off versus maximum in my tests. I see no visual or much performance difference going from medium to high or even very high on ray tracing, with low to medium being the most impactful on a visual scale and performance cost. High seems to increase the ray length into the depth buffer and rays per pixel, which largely improves reflection quality, and medium is the best balance, which is what consoles look to align with, and the PS5 Pro runs both diffuse and specular in quality and balance mode, and ray trace diffuse only in its performance mode. Low and medium shadows offer approximately 16% higher performance over ultra shadows. Medium is the best option. Lighting can be costly. Low versus medium costs around 2%, but medium to high is a heftier 8% more. Ultra is a further 13% on that, making it almost as expensive as ray tracing off versus on, going from low to ultra at a whopping 25.7%. Medium is the best balance. High is the best quality, which is what consoles run at in its quality and balance mode, but they all move to very high in cutscenes as it adds hair shadows only at this level, which you need to enable on the PC to get that in cutscenes also. Hair can offer 13% gain going from strands off to very high all characters. Player character only is the best bang for buck though, costing approximately 6% off versus on, which is what we choose and matches consoles in quality and balance mode. Textures for 12GB GPUs or lower, then texture streaming and virtual textures need to be set to medium. If 6GB or lower, then low needs to be set here. 16GB or higher can just max these out. And finally, level of detail on micropolygons and grass can be an obvious cost, which consoles stick to high, and this reduces pop-in at that level and costs approximately 5% over low, but beyond this, ultra high can cost a further 9%, making it over 15% going from low to ultra for a small gain. But high is the best balance, stopping most of the popping and imposter swaps in the world for a small time frame cost. Consoles run this in performance mode, but move to very high in balanced and quality mode, but this setting can impact CPU and memory, so be aware of that in the performance section. You can see all the closest matching settings for PC's optimized settings on screen against consoles. And next we'll go through our 4 test case PCs. Low end or entry level, which is my RTX4050. Medium spec PC, which is an RTX2070 with a 2700 CPU. Recommended or console equivalent, an RX6800 with a 5600X. And then the top end best you can get, RTX5090 paired with a 7950X 3D CPU. So starting at the bottom end, the RTX 4050 laptop simply does not have enough GPU grunt and VRAM space to be able to run ray tracing no matter what you do with the settings. And this is using DLSS at 1080p. But once you disable ray tracing and run my optimal settings, then you can hold on to that 30 FPS target. It definitely has some skips and jitters throughout play, but this is true of all PC versions, which can randomly spike at frame times randomly throughout the game, and certainly when streaming and riding through it very quickly, which is a big impact on both consoles and PC. You definitely get streaming issues throughout play. But fundamentally, this machine can only target 30 FPS, and I would cap outside of the game's in-game cap because it doesn't seem to work very well, and they definitely have a timing issue in their engine because, like I mentioned before, the cutscenes run at 30 FPS, and certain sequences in gameplay can also target just above 60, even when you're capped at 60 FPS in that main menu. If you can, use something like Afterburner to cap it at 30 FPS or another third-party mod. But you will have some judder riding through the world, and certainly in those heavier combat sections with lots of alpha, fog, characters, micropolygons, and SSR and reflections. All of those things can add up to a slight impact on overall performance, but 30 FPS is within reach, and it still looks good on the little laptop. Now next up is my aging RTX 2070 paired with the 2700, and unsurprisingly this can become more limited by CPU at certain points in the game, but it's certainly mostly GPU bound. You can't run ray tracing on this machine even at 1080p unless you cap to 30 FPS, and it can do it pretty well, but it will have some more judder and stutter, and therefore I recommend playing this game at a VRR or G-Sync level of frame rate around 50 to 60 FPS using 1440p DLSS balanced, and then using those optimal settings, which is closest to the recommended settings in the menu you just saw, but taking off ray tracing and using basically hideout diffuse only. This does give you a pretty decent level of performance both in combat and streaming through the world, but it certainly isn't the best way to play, and it falls far short of the console versions both in the base PS5 and certainly the PS5 Pro. So moving up the stack to my RX6800 paired with a 5600X CPU, we can target 4K DRS FSR3, which scales between 33 and 100% of the resolution, but this is really going to struggle to target 60 FPS. It can hover somewhere between the 30s and 40s in the most stressful sections. Here, this opening battle is one of the ones that really stresses the GPU, and at this point, it's largely a 30 FPS title. In other sections of the world, it can hover closer to the 40s and 50s, but really you need to knock ray tracing down to diffuse only and or drop to 1440p, which gives you a pretty close locked 60 FPS, bar some judders and stutters at certain points throughout the game, but this happens on every tested piece of hardware, irrespective of how powerful it is, and this includes the consoles in both the PS5 and PS5 Pro, which does point to the fact that there are still some issues within the engine that need some tweaking and optimization that can cause random frame spikes and times, but it does impact PC far more than console, so capping the frame rate to 30 or 60 outside of the in-game cap can also help these levels because you don't get such erratic frame pacing. And last but by no means least is the top end machine. Now there's no settings shown here because fundamentally you just max it out. That's what you're seeing. This is 4K DLSS DRS, which means it'll hover somewhere between 44 and 100% of resolution, and at times it can still be at native 4K, but it's often below that even on these settings. But it can hover in the heavier sections here by this port, which really stresses out every piece of kit. It can hover somewhere close to 60 FPS, and it's maxing out the GPU and pushing that resolution down below native 4K, often somewhere between 1620p or 1440p at its heaviest point. But fundamentally the game at this settings on the highest end machines I can throw at it and the best GPU you can buy, this hovers around 80 FPS at these settings. Now, this is maxed out over the top. You don't need to run this. You can lower some of the settings and push some of the resolution options down, certainly ray tracing, knock some of those down a little bit, the level of detail, and you can hover at 120 FPS, close enough to pretty much lock to that level on this particular machine. And this kind of gives you an example of how demanding the engine still is. It can scale, and even better hardware could probably run these settings at native 4K in the future at 120 FPS. And it isn't fully CPU bound, but again, this machine highlights the point I was mentioning about the stuttering. The higher the frame rate, and therefore frame times, the lower they become, the more erratic the frame times can become. And here you can still get up to 200 millisecond stutters that can last for periods of time, which feel terrible when you're running somewhere in the 80s or 90 FPS range. Now, this isn't a bad performing game by any stretch of the imagination, but the higher the frame rates and the lower the frame times go, the more you'll feel these inconsistencies. Therefore, even on this machine, I recommend you cap at 60 FPS at these settings, or lower them a little and cap at 120. And much of what I've covered here is true for consoles and PC, and taking my PS5 and PS5 Pro as the best example of what we have, we see three modes on each to choose from: performance, balance and quality, and only quality targets 4K on PS5 using Anvil's own TAAU to increase that DRS level to 4K. From many accounts, it operates between 1240p and 1620p, but runs RTGI in the world but SSR reflections. This is also true in the hideout, which is capped at 30 FPS on all modes once you enter. The PS5 Pro targets the same 4K output, again using TAAU, and it's often within the same ranges of resolution, but the console offers the full RT experience, with reflections now being handled by ray tracing both in the open world and in the hideout, which is still capped at 30 FPS even on the Pro. Balanced is next, now seems to target 1440 with a bottom end of approximately 1080p. This is certainly softer at times, but aside a small LOD cutback, no ray tracing at all now on PS5, and PS5 Pro loses RT reflections down to SSR now, outside of the hideout anyway. Lower hair settings and possibly shadows, but could be resolution related. It looks very close. It does this at a new 40 FPS rate, so long as you have a 120Hz screen on PS5 and Pro, and the difference here is Pro is often at a slightly higher resolution and appears to still target 4K using DRS with RTGI enabled. Performance is last, but by no means least. Now the PS5 only tops out at 1240p and can scale down to 720p. This is by far the softest mode, and it loses hair splines, lower LOD, shadows, and again only RTGI in hideout means we do notice the sacrifices for that 60 FPS target, and it no longer upscales to 4K, looking to stay actually around 1240p. PS5 Pro can scale down to 900p levels, but it can also achieve 1440p, which appears to be its new target here, again using TAAU, but this manages to keep RTGI operational at least, and offers a slightly sharper image than base PS5. Now the PS5 in its performance mode does remain close to that level pretty well, but the game appears to have some random issues that impact performance without glaringly obvious causes. Some are streaming issues, some are likely related to the micropolygon work per frame, others may be ray tracing, DRS, and plain old fill rate or bandwidth related. But we can have some 33 millisecond spikes at times that can cause some judder, with readouts never going below 50 FPS in my tests. They're not frequent, but they happen enough to notice them when they do, but it's still a very smooth way to play the game by and large, and actually is a nice treat, because until the last couple of games, we haven't seen 60 FPS on consoles for an Assassin's Creed game very often at all. Now, the PlayStation 5 Pro does a better job of sticking to 60 FPS, give or take, but it still has similar levels of skitching, jumping, and frame drops, which never seem to exceed the 33 millisecond levels, but we do see, again, the same issues, which is streaming through the world, general GPU, bandwidth, fill rate with volumetrics, fire, characters. I do think micropolygons and ray tracing has some impact in terms of some of the dips we're seeing, and this comes to fruition in the opening section on both characters, which have some dense geometry, fire, alpha, fog, multiple skin characters, micro polygons, and on the PS5 Pro, in addition, ray tracing GI, no matter which mode you're running, which means it can dip ever so slightly lower in comparison to the PS5, still within the 50s, but again, it's probably 1 to 2%. You'd never notice it without this level of analysis, but as you can see in the opening battle here, when there's lots of fire, alpha, volumetrics, as the camera spins round, you'll see the resolution can dip a little heavier in this shot, but also it's not quite enough to keep that GPU in line. Again, these are the worst sections that I could find in the testing, and most battles, even out in the open world during the day and GI, it does run very close to 60 FPS, but certainly nighttime and certain times of day can be more impactful on the GPU. And just as I was finishing this video off, the latest update came from Ubisoft, which added PSSR into the mix, which means you can now turn it on and off as needed in the game itself using TAAU and PSSR. This does improve the image quality, and it's mostly beneficial in the performance mode, but as you can see here, it does have an impact on performance, which can actually lower the performance level on the PS5 Pro below the PS5 now, and on the worst case scenarios, again testing this opening battle, we can be around 9% slower, both frame to frame and on average during this opening battle section, using the PlayStation 5 Pro and PSSR versus TAAU, which means it's costing around 1.5 to 1.6 milliseconds per frame, which means, based on the original announcement of the PS5 Pro from Mark Cerny and my test with games such as Ragnarok, where you can turn it on and off, it used to cost approximately 2 milliseconds. So we are seeing a improvement here on the overall time it takes for PSSR to run, so that it looks like this might be the result of a new update in terms of the firmware that recently came out and the team working on the engine themselves. But I can't get into that just now, as I'll never finish this video, but I will have one coming straight up after this one, which will delve into the update that PSSR brings to the game on PS5 and PS5 Pro, which I'll cover specifically. Now, outside of performance, quality mode is pretty much a lock 30 FPS on both. There's no real dips. There are a couple of drop frames every now and then. You can get a few stutters into 33, 16 millisecond skips at certain points. But again, most of them look to be memory bound, and certainly the 40 FPS mode suffers more on the PS5, where it can sometimes skip into the next 33 milliseconds down to 16 milliseconds and back and forth, and it certainly does that more often than the PS5 Pro, so there's probably a little bit of a memory limit there in terms of that 40 FPS balance mode. But generally both of these modes hit that target rate far more frequently than the 60 FPS mode, and if you do want the best balance of visual quality, then I do recommend the balance mode. For me, it is the best balance because it does offer almost identical levels of visual quality to quality mode on the PS5 Pro, and it's good enough on the PS5. At least it's got the hair and the performance feels smooth enough to get away from it. But if you are after a 60 FPS readout, then the performance mode is still the best one to pick on all three consoles, and it certainly isn't a bad performing title on the PS5 and PS5 Pro, but I'll be covering the PSSR mode very soon. The Assassin's Creed series has been around for almost 20 years now, and in that time the series has grown in size, scale and rendering quality. With AC Shadows, they've ramped up the technical toolkit with a very obvious leaning towards key areas of the Snowdrop engine, from massive volumetric clouds, procedural destruction and of course RTGI and reflections. But the core engine limits, gameplay loop and combat do not feel as pushed forward as much as the veneer cover. AI is still very poor, robotic attacks, basic state models, clumps of enemies standing around doing nothing, and it feels far older in that score than the huge strides taken elsewhere. And fundamentally, many of the key aspects we still appreciate today were introduced many years and versions ago, right back to AC Unity and even Black Flag. But most impactful are the bugs. Many times kills and assassinations would fail. Traversal can get you stuck on odd surfaces as it tracks an obvious spline through the scenery. Horse travel feels the most jarring, but combat also lacks the skill, range and flamboyant timing and parry that we got in Ghost of Tsushima, and it is impossible to not compare the two. That game really drives you through the world but allows you to explore freely, whereas here it feels like clumps of areas put together, and once you veer off that path it never feels quite as consistent or coherent as Ghost of Tsushima did. And on that score it falls far short of the mark. It does still look stunning with excellent materials, lighting, foliage, draw and models, albeit some areas in those cutscenes can be a range of very good or not so good. But the demands on all hardware still feel higher compared to the visual returns and performance, certainly on the RTX5090 area and far less in the PS5 Pro, but the PSSR and balanced ray tracing updates have shown there is clear room for improvement, and the team will likely continue to patch and improve. But after a near 6-month delay, I would have hoped for a slightly higher level of quality, but I'm very glad, as the version we should have got last year would have been far worse and not as polished as the version we got to enjoy now. And that's it for another deep dive into game technology, PC, performance and all things console and video game related. Remember, if you like what I do, please like, share, subscribe, and if you can, support me over on Patreon for a few dollars or pounds a month. It really helps. Leave a comment down below because it helps the algorithm. And obviously share this video where possible. Be sure to check back very soon where I've got more on that PSSR update on the PS5 Pro and just what it does to performance, but you've seen a taste of it here already. And obviously I've still got a lot more content to come on this channel and over on IGN, but I'll catch you very soon on the next one.